Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burke and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. You can join by going to preservelincoln.org. May for the Preservation Association of Lincoln is Preservation Month, and we have some activities lined up for May. Our brown bag will start it off on the second Tuesday. On May 18th, the Wyuka Cemetery Tour with Ed Zimmer will occur at 2 p.m. at Wyuka. May 22nd is the Art Springs from the Heart. It's an art show at Rogers House where you can purchase art or get it as part of your admission. May 29th is Ed Zimmer is going to give a tour of the Haymarket and the West Haymarket, and we're going to end at Lead Bellies with also, that day is also the Give to Lincoln event. And then the first week in June is going to be an open house at NeighborWorks in their new facility on R Street. And you will be able to go to preservelincoln.org to see all these activities, and we'll have flyers also sent out. Today, our speaker this will be the 9th of a series of lectures with Jim McKee. To support this series, the support for this series is provided by Speedway Properties. Please join me in thanking Speedway Properties for the generous support of the videotaping and other expenses associated with this series. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is a lifelong Lincolnite. His great-grandparents pioneered in Lancaster counties in the 1870s. He has a bachelor's degree from UNL and operates J&L Lee Company. He has written over 1,000 articles and books on Lincoln and Nebraska history, and he's on the Nebraska State Historical Society Board of Trustees and also serves on the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Commission, and he's also a founding member of the Preservation Association of Lincoln. And this is the 9th of a series of over 25 talks in the next couple of years. The series is titled Jim McKee's Complete History of Lincoln, and this is program number 9. Jim invites you to ask questions during the program. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
We all have the introduction memorized now. Well, we'll pick up today with the Ag Campus, and I think I mentioned last time, but if I did not, it says the complete history of Lincoln, but obviously it ain't. And one of the things that we could have spent certainly at least one entire hour on, maybe two, would be the Ag Campus or the East Campus. And it's a possibility at the end when we get all done, maybe we'll have some appendices or some extra addendum. And certainly the Ag Campus would be one of the things that we could talk about in detail. We'll spend a few minutes on it today. The Land Grant Act of 1862, sometimes called the Morrill Act, one of its clear intentions was that states or territories which applied under the Morrill Act had to offer related topics to agriculture and the mechanical arts. So when the University of Nebraska's charter was written in 1869, clearly it called for a school of agriculture or a college of agriculture and 5 other colleges as well, and it also provided that 2 sections of agriculture land or saline lands would be set aside for a model farm. And it's unclear to me, perhaps Kay knows, whether this was truly a section, 640 acres, a square mile. I'm not sure whether they were speaking more generally just of a section of land, a tract of land, or a section of land. Saline lands, of course, were reserved by the federal government from the days of the origination of the United States to be the property of the federal government. And when we get along in another 6 months or so, maybe we'll see that this produces some problems in and around the city of Lincoln, because we've got a lot of saline land around here, and it was unclear when the state of Nebraska took over whether some of these saline lands reverted to the state of Nebraska or stayed with the federal government. So interesting lands. The college lands were granted to territories and to states by the federal government. So it said specifically a model farm. But when the university opened, 1869, 1870, there still was no provision for an agriculture college whatsoever, partially because there was a great argument as to whether we really wanted to have a model farm or whether we wanted to have an experimental farm. And this raged on, and of course the obvious thing happened ultimately. We had a little bit of both, but a long time is going to take before we get to that point. So still, without a college of agriculture, a man by the name of S.R. Thompson became the chair of the Department of Practical Agriculture. Keep wanting to say architecture, but I mean agriculture. And at that point in time, there was a suggestion by some people on both the staff of the school and as well as legislators that maybe we ought to change the name of the building at 11th and R to the School of Agriculture, just simply to indicate to the federal government that we really had established a School of Agriculture as required by the Morrill Act. But nothing came of that, and it was obvious to everybody that we did not have a College of Agriculture. But Mr. Thompson was warned by the chancellor at that time not to enter on his duties for more than or less than a year. There were no students in agriculture at the point, so it was an easy instruction to follow. There are no students, no reason to start the school. The following year, the legislature appropriated $1,000 for the College of Agriculture. But in 1874, time has passed, and the chancellor says there is still no demand for agriculture classes, and that students were not urged into that field of study. However, in the meantime, we had established a sort of a College of Agriculture, at least physically, on the land which lay at that time between the county fairgrounds and the university campus. If you can imagine that area, it's now, of course, all University of Nebraska anyway, but at that time it was considerably apart. And they set up two sections of land were set aside east of the railroad and in the neighborhood of the fairgrounds. And this leads me to believe that it probably was not a section of a square mile, but just a tract of land. They began working with sugar beet production and swine production in that area, that physical area. Still, no College of Agriculture exists. And nobody really thought much about the farm at all as it existed until the prevailing winds started coming later in the year out of the north. And at that point in time, the swine production made itself known in the city of Lincoln and on the university campus. And it was at that point that, and at this time we didn't know who it was, but we now look back and know absolutely who it was, a young man by the name of Roscoe Pound thought that he had the answer to this. And in fact, we may have even touched on this earlier, I'm not sure, but Roscoe went on his own, apparently, no one was with him. And he stole the ROTC cannon, charged it with crushed bricks, tipped it down, and fired it off through the swine farm. And the following morning, the newspaper said that persons or a person unknown had reduced the offending area to 2 loads of kindling and 1 load of bacon. And at that point, nobody knew who it was, but it later turns out to have been good old Roscoe. Well, the regents did not miss the point of the article and quickly determined that there was no sufficient part of the land in question that was suitable for farming at all. So they sold one of the sections of land for $6,000 to persons unknown. Then in 1874, the regents acted to buy the farm of Moses Culver, which we see here. Now, this truly was a half section of land. It ran from 27th Street to 33rd to 48th Street, 33rd to 48th, and we're standing here on the corner of 48th and Holdridge, looking towards the east, when Holdridge was at that point still just a dirt road. It went from Holdridge to the north to a rough line of Dead Man's Run. So it was kind of uneven on the other end. They bought that for $17,600 or $55 an acre, which was a pretty good return, I think, to Mr. Culver. I'm not sure what he paid for it, but most of the land that was being sold by the railroads at that time was probably averaging around $7 an acre. And we know that the Union Pacific had sold off 2 rather large tracts of land out in the western part of the state for 25 cents an acre. So I'm assuming that Mr. Culver did okay on this. About half of that half section of land was devoted to farming, And they did build a two-story frame building, which was noted as a dormitory for students who are going to be living on the campus. The two-story building is on the left, and this would be a dormitory for students who would live on the ag campus to maintain the farm and its whatever herds or production that they might have at that point in time. At that point in time, the Nebraska State Journal editorialized by 1878 that the Regents still held the land, which in effect was where the county fairgrounds were, and some land near the city. And they suggested that they sell that land in order to make enough money to pay off the $17,000 that they paid Mr. Culver. But they also said they should hang on to the 80 acres of land which contained the racetrack. Does this sound kind of familiar? Well, a short time later, they did sell off more land. They sold off roughly $16,800 worth of land, and later they paid off the dormitory by selling another 20 acres of land. But all the classes at this point in time were still held downtown. In 1896, they will build the first actual classroom building on the East Campus. It'll cost $6,900 to build. That's Moses Culver's home on the right-hand side, and the dormitory is on the left-hand side, by the way. In 1923, the small building is removed. We're not sure. They said they moved it into the city of Lincoln, and we can't be sure where. There is some indication that it may have been moved across the street on today what would be Milder Manor off to the west, but we have no real indication that that was the case. This is the first building built on the campus, $6,900. It was originally a frame structure and later bricked over. It had many, many uses through the years, and in fact, I think this is probably where you first would have gone to the dairy store and gotten a double-dip ice cream cone for a nickel. Now, the dairy store has moved now directly to the north into a new, much newer building. This building was torn down in 1973, and it cost 10 times as much to tear down as it has cost to build, which is pretty standard. The next building, which is still extant, of any importance in 1899, was the Agriculture Experimental Station. This was about the same time that the East Campus developed that sort of a boulevard and loop, or whatever you want to call it, out there. One of the big problems that still existed on the campus at that time was there were no roads that were paved, there were no sidewalks on the campus, and the streetcar ran only as far as 27th Street. So even to get to the edge of the campus, you had to walk from 27th to 33rd. At that point in time, the University Bulletin, which was issued every year, said that an educated farmer is to be envied, for he enjoys more privileges than any other man at the farm. The agriculture student can find at the dormitory there a pleasant home, far enough from the way of the city to be out of the way of its temptations to idleness and worse. And as I often say, most of my 4 years at the university was spent searching for the and worse, and never really found it. Holdridge was ultimately paved in 1912, so the mud that we saw earlier will have been removed. In 1877, an architect reported that the downtown building on the campus, and we talked about this a couple of times ago, was of such inferior quality that it should be not repaired but torn down, and a new building should be built. And at that time, the University of Michigan, I don't know whether they asked the University of Michigan or whether they just simply offered it, but the University of Michigan said that they should relocate the university to a site of not less than 40 acres, 50 acres if you can get it. And of course, the obvious site for that would be to move the university from downtown Lincoln, land which would be presumably worth more commercially, to the ag campus. In fact, in 1898, Dean Charles Bessie made the suggestion very strongly that they consolidate the downtown campus with the ag campus. And later, Chancellor Samuel Avery and the regents agreed as well. And in fact, in 1910, 1911, the legislature appropriated a 1 mill levy to move and consolidate the two campuses. The consolidation bill passed the Senate, but failed in the lower house of the legislature. Then finally in 1914, and for reasons unclear, they put it up to a vote of the people. Almost always a mistake. But the people voted very clearly to leave both campuses intact. In 1974, what I call the College of Agriculture became the IANR, for the Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. And of course, that campus now shares its campus with the College of Dentistry, College of Law, Married Students Housing, and the Barclay Center, and so forth. One of the questions which occurred to me was, would the university not have been maybe better off to not have sold the fairgrounds at that point in time? And they would have had them anyway, but that's hindsight. This is a photograph, probably 1904, 1905, looking over the campus and looking off towards the north. None of these buildings currently remain. This is an interesting spot, and I don't know, maybe Kay knows where these were. They were built at the East Campus, or the Ag Campus, during World War I, of course, to partially hold troops who were also being quartered in the then just barely and not totally completed Social Sciences building, which is now, I think, the College of Business Administration. So this building, I don't know where it's at, and Eileen, you're going to be up now, but it was someplace on the East Campus, and that's all we know about it, for troops to be quartered. This is the point where our program breaks and we change slide trays. And we'll be talking now about Lincoln's first office building, and I'll start to talk about it while Eileen is changing the tray. This is Lincoln's first office building and its first bank as well. In 1826, a man was born by the name of James Sweet. He was born in New York, and by the time he was an adult, he was urged to wrong thing. I'm sorry. You're right. And I'm wrong. Okay. This is the right tray. We're going to break at this point and stop for 1869 and kind of insert this tray, because this is the tray about the Haymarket district. And this is an overview taken in 1923 of the area that we generally think of today as the Haymarket area. The Haymarket itself was not originally what we think of as a wholesale district, or a Haymarket for that matter of fact. It was a residential area, and an area where there were small businesses, houses, but they would have been pretty small houses, and a few businesses. This would be from the inception of the city of Lincoln in 1867 up until about 1869, 1870. Now, one of the things that immediately the state of Nebraska wanted for the city of Lincoln was they felt that the city should have a railroad, and being the capital, the state, the counties, the cities sort of developed a contest and offered land, bond issues, and so forth to encourage building a railroad from the Missouri River to the city of Lincoln. And it became quite a contest. The first engine to reach the city of Lincoln was probably this one, the engine Wahoo, which is going to arrive, they hope to get here on July the 4th of 1870, and would have. But there were no rails, so it got delayed a little bit. This is supposedly the engine that arrived first. This is the Atgrade Crossing at 7th and roughly R Street. Godfrey's elevator is on the right-hand side of the picture. This would be approximately the site of the present arena, or maybe the site of the U.S. Post Office. We are looking towards the west. We can see an interesting hitching post. We can see the road is dirt, and we can also see wooden sidewalks. And we can see now that trains have actually arrived in the city of Lincoln. That first train, which we hope to get here on July the 4th, actually only got as far as Newton, Nebraska. And Newton was a platted but never occupied area of land on Highway 6 near where we today have Novartis Drug Company. Novartis would be kind of on the edge of it. About all we know, we have a plat of the land, and we see the railroad going through it on a diagonal, and that's where Newton is. That's where the train got July the 4th. Then on July the 26th, the first train actually got to the city of Lincoln, and that was pulled by the engine Hurricane. But on 26th, 1870, July, there was still no traffic through. A train could get here from the east, but could go no further. So actually, we look at the first service to Lincoln, where there are trains arriving and going on, of August the 9th of 1870. So we're looking in that direction. And here's an interesting statistic for those of you who are interested in statistics. Of course, all of the railroads received large grants of land from the federal government, supplemented by grants from the state, and in some cases counties and even cities. The Burlington in Nebraska received from the federal government 40-odd thousand of acres of land, and a total in Nebraska of 2,374,090 acres of land. That's just the Burlington. The Union Pacific did a little better. They got 4,846,108 acres of land in Nebraska. And all of the railroads, primarily the Burlington and the Union Pacific, received grants of 8,172,859 acres of land, which was at that point 16.6% of the entire area of Nebraska map.
Would the railroads have set aside stockpiles of wood at various points along the line?
They
Locomotives or how, out on the prairie?
Okay, well, one of the things that we may have talked about is, now the question was, would the railroads have set aside stockpiles of wood to fuel the engines? Is that what you're thinking of? They had a couple of problems. One of them was that they had to take the ties and bring them in as well. So they would set up, and this is where we see the land companies, the Lancaster Land Company and so forth, would be set up by the railroads, and that's a Lancaster Land Company was set up by the Burlington. And they would establish every 7 to 10 miles a depot, a siding, and hopefully a city. One of the things was to provide a place where they could be cold or wood provided and watered. And most of this had to be brought in. So it would be brought in, and every place they stopped would be the end of the line temporarily. They would bring in coal stations, timber stations, but the timber came for two reasons. They were bringing in lumber for railroad ties. And these original railroad ties, when you look at them, they weren't squarely cut. They were really just pieces of logs and stuff like that, which is what enabled them to lay that railroad so quickly across Nebraska. So I don't know whether I exactly answered your question, but yes, the railroad would establish wood stations, coaling stations, and watering stations, as well as bringing in a great amount of timber, since there wasn't any in Nebraska to speak of, except along the river. And we do find them mining, if you will, the cottonwood along the way, along the rivers to ties mostly, and some fueling. So 16.6% of the state of Nebraska is owned by the railroads. This picture is probably 1873, something like that, and we are probably looking at Godfrey's elevator, which was on the, certainly on the north side of the street. There were no cross streets. We can't much tell more than that. Now the Burlington was the one that won that contest, by the way. They got here first, and they were on state lands. They were on county lands. They got bonds from the city of Lincoln. They got bonds on their way here from other areas as well. This is a picture which many of us have seen so many times that it tells us a lot, but it also is probably one of the first really good pictures we have of the yard. We're probably standing approximately on O Street, maybe closer to P Street, probably about 7th Street. I mean, we don't know exactly. The maps at the time are a little unclear. In fact, the early maps show the railroad coming in at a diagonal instead of turning and straight in. But we are looking roughly towards the northwest, we feel. We are looking at the bottom area of the land down there along Salt Creek and the floodplain. This is the reason the railroad came through here. It was flat. Secondly, this is the land that was set aside for the railroad. And thirdly, we can see see the people walking on the sidewalk there. If you look just to their left, we can see that already the land has been built up. So we know that the land that is now where the Haymarket is, I think Peter Bleed figures and others that the land has probably been built up 7 to 12 or 15 feet in some areas. So it's still in the floodplain, sort of, but it's been built up a lot, and yet we don't have any, I don't think any of those new buildings down there will have basements or anything. There's still some danger. But we can see it built up there. On the left-hand side, the building with the dormers is the immigrant house. The immigrant house was set up to attract buyers to buy land from the Burlington. And of course, we think of the Burlington and the Union Pacific coming across here and owning vast numbers of acres of land. But remember, every other alternate square mile, roughly, for example, the Union Pacific, the railroad only of this land takes up a pencil-thin line through the middle of it for its trackage. And the way that they financed the building of the railroad was to sell off all the rest of this excess of land to finance it. So remember when Tuttle Creek Dam was built down to our south? When I was a kid, they would send out in the newspaper and mail advertisements urging you to come down to Tuttle Creek Dam to look at the lots and the land that they were selling. And if you would agree to come down and take a look at it, they would put you up in a hotel overnight. They would buy you dinner, they would buy you breakfast, and one of them they gave you a free Timex watch, a great inducement, if you would just listen to their story about buying land. The Burlington did something similar. They had excursion trains, if you will, leaving from the east, people coming out here. They would have them come out and look at land, encouraging them to buy. And most of the land that the Burlington was selling was $5, $6, $7, $8 an acre, depending on where it was, how rich it was, how close it was to water, and so forth. And they said about half of the people that they induced to come out and look at land actually purchased land, which is a pretty good percentage. Now, if you bought land and say you came from Indiana and were going to come to Nebraska, depending upon how much land you purchased from the railroad received permission from the federal government to offer special rates. And these rates would be inclusive of a railroad car, a box car. And the idea was if you came from Indiana, for example, you could take that box car at your point of departure and put on it your livestock, your furniture, and your family. Now, depending again on how much land you bought and where, the railroad would give you a half-price ticket for that car, or maybe even free. So if you bought enough land, you could come with your furniture and livestock and family free of charge from Indiana or wherever in the east to Lincoln. And when you got to Lincoln, they had an immigrant house. There was also an immigrant house, for example, at Omaha, later one at Henderson, a different railroad. But the idea would be as they sold off this land and filled up the land, the immigrant houses would move further and further west. The immigrant house in Lincoln is there on the left-hand side. It was built in the summer of 1871, 2 stories tall, roughly 24 by 100 feet, and they said it would sleep 10 families. There were separate bathing facilities for men and women. There was a kitchen and a dining room, and basically the staying in this building was free of charge if you bought land. And the idea would be you would come on the railroad, stay overnight perhaps, give you a chance to unload your furniture, your family, and your belongings, and go out to the land you had bought. No charge may have been a stretch, because if you wanted hot water, you had to pay for the coal to burn to heat the water. But other than that, it was free. By June the 20th of 1872, so roughly a year later, they said that 636 women and children had spent at least one night in the immigrant house. Some of those people would have stayed more than one night, conceivably a couple. But no men and no boys were mentioned on that census. Now, what this says to me is, and I have no way of proving it, but it says to me is that probably if you have a boxcar with your furniture and your livestock in it and your family possessions, the man and the boys would stay in the boxcar overnight to protect it. And it makes sense, but I don't know whether that's true or not. We think that that immigrant house, and this is mostly from descriptions that were left to us in words, because none of these buildings had foundations, none of these buildings had basements. So when Peter Bleed, for example, goes poking around down there, we can't find evidence of any of these buildings. They were built on top of the ground for all intents and purposes. We think it was probably more or less directly west of what I call the old Burlington station. Now we have a new one, but we have to contend with new and old now. Probably maybe a block to the west, but we really can't say. Now, as the railroad arrived, the area immediately around it began to change, around where we have the depot built. And from small houses, we begin to have no houses, we begin to have no small businesses. They moved primarily to the east, somewhat to the south, but mostly to the east, and less to the north. But to the north, we'll still have a lot of little workmen's cottages and so forth. And as we move, this is a picture of the northeast corner of 7th and P Streets. This building right on the corner here started out as a large frame house, but it has in this picture been converted to Bennetts Hotel, a name which is going to stick on that property for many, many years. This is actually the corner back here, but out onto what we would think of as the sidewalk is a railroad ticket office, which was out onto the sidewalk area. We see these little businesses on the sidewalks, presumably leased by the city, much as they would lease areaway under the sidewalk and so forth, or air rights where you have something going over an alley. Presumably these would be leased by the city to an individual businessman. And there was a fruit market, for example, in front of Miller and Payne's building at 13th and O for decades after the original building stood there. So we know these happened, but quite quickly the little railroad ticket office will go down, and in 1915 the two-story frame building will come down, and the first brick Bennetts Hotel, 3 stories tall, will be built for $20,000. That same building is still there. The Bennett Hotel building in 1980s became Haymarket Junction, which was an attempt at a vertical mall. And I don't know that vertical malls in the United States hardly ever work, other than maybe the Center. I mean, there's certainly a vertical mall that worked very well. And one in Omaha worked for quite a while. The Center worked well, but they didn't last very well. Well, that vertical mall didn't last very long. Jabrisco restaurant went into the corner. The upper hotel ceased to function. During its last part of its days, it was a hotel almost exclusively used by the railroad for men working as a division point. For example, they might stay overnight before they returned home or whatever. And the restaurant on the lower level, the Bennett Hotel restaurant, when I was in the university, it was a favorite gathering spot because it was open literally 24 hours a day. And they used to call it Cafe Benet, but it was the Bennett Hotel. And also after a late night fraternity lecture series, perhaps, the recipients would then go over there to the Bennett, or maybe over to the Acme Chili Grill, where you could get something sort of offset the refreshments that had been had. So the building will stay. After Jabrisco, it became Fireworks, and of course it's still now Laszlo's has moved into it. As part of it is where their brewery is on the side, and I think probably Ed's going to tell you a lot about that when you tour over in the what I call the South Haymarket area. But I think that brewery is probably will move over into the Metagold property that they bought over there. So we're going to have a displacement of all the little houses and the little businesses very quickly as when the railroad arrives. This is what they call it, the second Burlington and Missouri River Railroad Depot. The first one was just that little Cottonwood affair we saw earlier. The building was completed coincidentally the same year that the bridge over the Missouri River was built, 1881. And it sat on a footprint almost exactly the same as where I call the Burlington, Missouri River Depot today. And of course it is no longer a depot, but this building sat almost there. So we are looking from the tracks towards the northeast in this picture. This depot, let's see, 54 by 182 feet. It cost $125,000, was considered to be absolutely up to date. And at that, it had no electricity and no indoor plumbing or bathing facilities. So up to date in its own way. Mr. Tuzlin of the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad, who was the vice president at that time, gave the food concession to a couple called the Swans, who actually spent $6,000 to put in a kitchen and a restaurant. They had the provision that they could charge no more than 50 cents for any meal, or if you were a railroad employee, they couldn't charge you more than 25 cents. But at that point in time, there was no dining car on the railroad. The railroad would pull up to, like Lincoln, for example. They would stop and be here for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and you would go in and get food and either take it on the train with you or eat it there very quickly. The third floor, the north half of the building, is described as being, to me, the most interesting part of the whole building. And it was an open area on which there were wooden pallets. So think of the left-hand side of the third floor, or the dormer roofed portion of this building, as a one large open room with pallets, covered with pallets. And on those pallets were glass jars, probably in the neighborhood of 18 to 24 inches tall. And it would be solid with those, with room to walk between them. And these glass jars would be filled with sulfuric acid and connected together with lead, copper, and so forth connectors. Because what was it? It was a storage battery. And that battery was actually used to power 907 miles of telegraph lines. And when the building was built, there was no electricity. So this would have been the way to power the telegraph originally. When electricity could be purchased along the ways, for example, in Lincoln in the 1890s, they would have been using this battery probably as a standby system. Can't be sure, but very interesting. By 1894, the first overpass will be built over the tracks. Because at this point in time, we have several railroads coming through, and lots of parallel north-south railroad tracks going through the yard. I don't have a date, but I have looked at maps and counted from the easternmost track, which was a siding, which was one of the last used, which delivered newspaper to the Lincoln Journal-Star newspaper plant there. That would be the furthest east siding. To the furthest west siding, there were 37 parallel north-south tracks. Most of those would have been sidings. But now imagine you're in an automobile or in a wagon and you're headed west on O Street. That means that you're going to have to cross a total of, maybe not 37, because obviously the journals didn't come all the way to O Street, but you're going to have to cross 30-some, let's say, railroad tracks. Well, this could be an almost impossibility, even though there wouldn't have been mainline traffic on all but maybe 4 or 5 of those at any given time. So, 1894, we have the first overpass built to make it possible to get from one end of the city to the other. But that's one of the big reasons that Lincoln did not initially develop towards the west was, 1, the floodplain of Salt Creek, and 2, the railroads. They really formed a barrier along there. This picture is taken from that first 1894 viaduct, probably taken about 1910. We know that this is a postcard, and this is more or less, would you not say, the height of the postcards, 1910, something like that. But we also know that 1910 was also just about the height of the use of the railroad in terms of numbers of trains going through the area. And in 1910, they were averaging 110 trains a day going through there. And they would often have as many as 25 passenger trains a day and 75 freight trains per day going through this yard area, if you will. But the most important or most interesting thing I think about that is that even with that number of trains, today, with more or less 2 tracks going through there, there are more railroad cars going through there than there were then. The average train then, I don't know what it was, but I know we would have trains, passenger trains, might be 3 or 4 cars. Very, very short trains, lots of very short trains. And today those coal trains have, I think, 117 is one of the numbers I hear bandied about. And I always thought that 117 probably meant that there was some sort of a limit placed on the length of trains, because when you get out on an on-grade crossing, that means you're going to have to sit there quite a while. But in fact, somebody told me there are no federal length of train laws, that some states have ordinances, but basically that 117 comes from how long a train they can load in Wyoming. So anyway, more train cars today going through there than there were then. 1910, we're looking from that viaduct, again looking towards the north. There is one building there which is extant. You can just barely see the edge of it over here. This is the Meadow Gold Creamery building, which we now call Ivana Cohn's building. What do we call it? The Creamery building, I think. And that's the only building that we would see that is still there today. The building was remodeled in 1906, and the tracks covers went along at that time. So we have Canopy Street built from those canopies. Now, the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad was the first railroad to reach Lincoln, but in fact, there was another railroad which was vying to be number one, didn't quite make it, and that was the Midland Pacific Railroad. They started in 1867 in Nebraska City and headed for the city of Lincoln, and their primary goal was, sure, they wanted to reach the city of Lincoln, but their primary goal was all of that free land and the inducements by way of bonds to build depots and so forth. So they formed in 1867, and their idea was to run to Lincoln and then have another track run from Lincoln to the south to Fort Riley. The county, Otoe County, which is where they started, Otoe County authorized $150,000 worth of bonds to build that railroad. And the reason was that they felt it would produce a lot of business in Nebraska City and Otoe County as well, which is where the Oregon Trail cutoff originally had come through. And their railroad will follow the Oregon Trail cutoff pretty much. And the Oregon Trail cutoff followed an old Indian trail. And today, not only do we still have the railroad running along there, but we also have Highway 2. So we started with an Indian trail and ended up with, today, Highway 2, a divided four-lane expressway, right literally over that same land. So 1867, they set up the railroad. 1868, they started the grade towards Lincoln. 1869, Nebraska entered the fray and offered 100,000 acres of land as an inducement. And they certainly hoped to get here before the Burlington, particularly when they heard that Lancaster County had offered another $50,000 in bonds to the first railroad, primarily to help offset the cost of building depots and structures. Well, they didn't get here until 1871. So they were the second railroad. They, about a year after the Burlington, Missouri River Railroad, their depot, which we see here, was originally located at approximately 5th and H Streets. Again, everything is sort of approximate. The maps they show it, but we can't really tell exactly where it was. This railroad in 1875 merged with the Brownville, Fort Kearny, and Pacific Railroad. All the railroads at that time really threw in the word Pacific. They had no intention of getting there, but it made them sound a whole lot better. 1939, this photograph is taken. The original depot has been picked up and moved to the southeast corner of 8th and N Streets, which is today Baker Hardware. It had been moved up there for the Holland Lumber Company. And the Holland Lumber Company used the original depot at this site just simply as storage. Now, of course, Baker's has now, in about 1950, they tore down this depot. Didn't take much to tear it down, I don't think. But if you look at the Baker Hardware building today, if you're able to step back and look at it, you can see that the east portion of that building is still very clearly the Holland Lumber Company. You can see the lumber sheds have just been sort of built around. And of course, I saw this building when I was a kid and had no idea what it was. Didn't mean much to me at all. Now, when the railroads came, one of the first things that came with it, in addition to moving out the residents there, were hotels. Now, this hotel was the Midland Pacific Hotel, probably designed to serve passengers coming in on the Midland Pacific. It was at approximately 6th and O Streets, and most probably it would have been on the south side of O Street. All that today would have been much later covered with tracks, and now would be parking lots almost entirely down in that area. The smaller building is called Bachelor Hall. We don't know anything about it. Presumably, it would have been a rooming house for railroad workers. Don't know much about it, but certainly a very, very early picture of the area. Now, since we're going to talk about the Haymarket area, we're not going to talk about all the buildings, and there again it would take a lot of time. We'll talk about a few of, I think, more interesting buildings. This is the Seaton Lee Ironworks, and it is the oldest extant building in the Haymarket area. In 1881, Seaton Lee had a foundry in Atchison, Kansas, and established a branch here in the city of Lincoln. They built a little building on the left, 3 stories tall. It is the northwest corner of 8th and Q. The building to the right or to the north would have been their foundry and oven, they called it. In 1882, the building on the corner was converted primarily to offices and a pattern shop and a warehouse. And by that time, they reported having between 20 and 30 men employed in the building. 1887, 5 years later, for reasons unclear to us, they simply closed and moved and reconsolidated at Atchison, Kansas. What were they building here? Well, they were probably building things like hitching posts or pouring or casting, probably hitching posts, maybe things like the fence around the university. Do we know whether it came from Seaton Lee, for example? I don't think so. I think it preceded it, but it's in that era. But they would have been building things like the cast iron fence. Matt, do we know anything about that? I don't know where that cast iron fence came. I'm not sure. Manhole covers, things like that, and cast iron building fronts, which we see down here, some of which are labeled Seaton Lee Lincoln, some of which are labeled Seaton Lee Atchison, but may have been cast in the city of Lincoln. I really don't know. The building at first became the Armour Cudahy building. Later, the Carter Transfer, Globe Delivery, Sullivan Transfer, and interestingly enough, it's going to be Leadbelly's, which is where your walking tour ends up, a restaurant today. The building is built of, like University Hall, of bricks which were fired in the open, not in a kiln. And so this is one of the very few, if not the only building in Lincoln that I know that's extant, where you can actually see a building built of these friable, open-air, burned bricks rather than kiln-fired bricks. So they're very soft. So when you do go to Leadbelly's, I urge you, don't mess around with the brick. It's very, very soft. Interesting thing about the building today, if you look at it, is that the sills, for example, are made of cast iron. So if you got a magnet with you, you should be able to tell. But parts of the building are cast iron, parts of them are the original brick. A little bit later on, the building begins to look pretty much as it does today. And it's going to be restaurants, a lot of them. The first restaurant in there that I know of, and it kind of, some of them changed so fast I may not have even caught them all, but La Paloma was one of the first ones that came in there. They came from Havelock, had a Mexican restaurant in there, and they are the ones that brought in the railroad car behind there, which is still used by the restaurant, I think, at least its predecessor was, as sort of a party room and kind of a fun place to have. But I don't know how the fire marshal feels about it, but it's kind of a fun place to have a party. That was in 1991. Then the Brazen Head moved in for a while, and that was, I think that was the pub that took apart and brought over an entire pub from Ireland and put it back inside the Brazen Head. Then it became Bechamel. Then it was the Capital City Grill. Then it was the Iron Street Works, or the 8th Street Iron Works. Then it was Magnolia. Some of these didn't last very long. If you blinked, you missed them. They were all pretty good places to eat, too. They just, none of them made it. And today it is Leadbelly's, which is owned by a gentleman who has another restaurant called Toast. And I think he put a lot of money into the building and did it very carefully in a very careful way that is sympathetic with the building. So I think he's got a good chance. Cast iron window sills, that's probably the most interesting thing. The building next to it, which is when Sullivan owned it, they built that part of the building, and they advertised it as having the top floor was primarily for the storage of pianos. Now, they could have stored anything up there, but the reason they wanted it advertised as piano storage was it was humidity and temperature controlled, which the rest of the building would not have been. And pianos, you don't want to have suffer lots of variation in humidity and temperature. many of the little buildings down there were, we notice as we look at them, hotels. And almost all the hotels, we'll have a couple of exceptions, but most of the hotels in any city when the railroad rides, that's where the hotels will be located. They want to be near the railroads where people get off of the railroad and want to step into a hotel. This is a Metropolitan Hotel, northwest corner of 8th and O Streets. If we look at city directories, we realize how very inaccurate the city directories are, because this hotel moves around down in there, moves around on the corners of the intersection, and it moves within a block of there. But pretty sure it was the northwest corner, which is today the Granger building, which also now has that wine shop in it, Bin something or another, I can't remember, that corner. That building was built in 1870, 1871. And by 1889, it was gone, and of course the Grangers will build in its place. Well, let's see, who owns that building? This is the second oldest building, probably, and I think this is Speedway Property, is it not? Going to be primarily, I think, condominiums and apartments, is that right? And micro-lofts, connected to and kind of associated to the hotel to the north as well. Okay, well, it started life with just the building on the corner, went probably either to here or here, this part of the building, kind of an interesting little building with a little kind of a cornice up there of brick. 1887, the Jones and Douglas Cracker Company. Now, they didn't manufacture crackers here. Probably, this is when the area that we call the Haymarket is going to come into its own as a wholesale area. And the other thing that I should have pointed out when I first started was it's never been a Haymarket. Never has been. And we'll see why the name caught a little bit later on, but it never a Haymarket down there. 1905, the first edition was made, and it became the National Biscuit Company, which we think of today as Nabisco, moved into the building. Again, not in production, but merely taking things off the trains, and as a wholesale district. 1905, it was leased and became the Lincoln Hardware Company, which was owned by two gentlemen in Lincoln, Robert M. Joyce and Elmer Hinkle. In 1910, they changed the name, bought the building, and it became Hinkle and Joyce. And that's the way most of us remember it, as the Hinkle and Joyce Hardware Company. Later on, it was the Tool House at Hinkle and Joyce. And now, is there a name for that building, Clay?
The Tool House.
The Tool House. Very clever. And when we go down and look at it, I think, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but we actually, I think you uncovered part of this original sign right here. What we'll do with that, I don't know. Or maybe you've already done something with it there. I'm not sure either. And I'd say 2011, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the furthest north portion of the building was raised as being, again, made out of that porous brick, which was not easily worked around. So that the hotel, which is built on the north half of the block, now connects to this part of the building. I think we got time for one more. This is the Buckstaff Brothers Saddlery building. It's on the north side of O Street. The building was not raised until the 1960s. We can see one building in there, which many of you remember, and that would be the Lincoln Hotel building over here, which is where the Holiday Inn sits today. Mr. Buckstaff came to Lincoln from Wisconsin in 1869, so the city of Lincoln was only a couple of years old. And in 1886, he built the west half of this building, the left half of the building, 726-0. Then sometime in the 1890s, he added the right half or the east half of the building. By 1886, he said that he had 50 employees working out of this building, 3 salesmen on the road, and he maintained a constant inventory of $50,000 worth of harnesses and blankets in this building. And a question. No, that's just a time count. Okay. The Buckstaffs had all sorts of businesses in Lincoln. They owned the Vitrified Paving and Pressed Brick Company, which was the 7th and K, the Badger Lumber Company, catch the Wisconsin connection there, the Lincoln Paper Manufacturing Company, which was, and you may not have realized this, Clay, very nearly on property which you also own, which would be at a roughly First and Van Dorn, but considerably to the south of there, because they were on the creek originally. They were producing a 72-inch wide run of paper, and making about 130,000 yards of paper a day out there. They owned the Wisconsin Furniture and Coffin Company, which was a huge building, 5 stories tall, down in the South Haymarket. Stout and Buckstaff paving contractors and so forth. Lots of businesses in the city of Lincoln. But in the 1960s, this building was raised to become a parking lot for the building next door, the Granger building, which was being converted to apartments at that time. Again, the Historic Preservation Commission, we asked that they save a ghost of this building if possible, and they did, but the merest ghost. And there's the Granger building, and if you look carefully today, you can see that right along, well, you can't see here, this pillar is part of the original building, and that's all that's left of it, and we have a parking lot in its stead. That brings us up to about an hour, so I would now ask if there are any questions or comments.
The storage battery you described,
Right.
is it not necessary to recharge it at intervals?
Well, you know, that's a question which has been asked before, and a question which we're unclear of how it worked, but as I approached the question to somebody I thought would know, they said it was recharged chemically. Now, that doesn't really answer the question, as far as I'm concerned, because sulfuric acid, you know, you would add water to it and keep the water level up, which would not recharge the batteries. So, the only other answer we have, and it's not a true answer, but it's the best I can do, is that they did have a windmill very near this building. Now, it would have been potentially possible to have a wind charger attached to that windmill, but I can't honestly tell you that that is the answer to your question. And I wish I had a better answer, because it is a frequently asked question, and I guess maybe I just hope nobody asks the question again, unless somebody else has come up with a better answer than I, but that's the best I can do. And originally would have charged, I guess, itself, I don't know. But at any rate, it didn't probably serve as its primary source of electricity for the 907 miles of telegraph line very long, because in the 1890s, Lincoln is going to have electrification, and it would be easily obtainable at that point in time. And it would have been direct current, too, which would work fine. Another question? If not, I think we will be here again next month to pick up at this point, and finish up the Haymarket, probably, and return to looking at the city of Lincoln more closely. So unless there is another question, we'll ring down the curtain and see you in a month.